Her own mother said it. Not in a whisper. Not in the privacy of a closed room. She said it in the middle of the palace corridor, loudly enough that 2 footmen, a court lady, and the Duke-King of Valdenmere all heard every word. She is too broken to be loved. No man of rank will take her. She is a burden dressed in silk and nothing more. The corridor went silent. And the Duke-King of Valdenmere, a man who had fought 2 wars, dissolved 3 treaties, and never once been known to act without calculation, turned from where he stood at the far end of the passage, fixed his dark eyes on Lady Seraphine Vale, and walked toward her with the quiet, unhurried certainty of a man who had just made a decision. He stopped before her mother. He did not look at her mother. He looked at Seraphine. He said only this, "I heard you." And then, to her mother, still without raising his voice, "You are wrong." Then he walked away. What kind of man hears a woman called broken and treats it as a challenge worth accepting? What kind of woman, shattered by years of being told she is not enough, allows herself to believe him? And what will it cost them both when the court discovers that the Duke-King of Valdenmere has decided to prove something the entire palace said was impossible? If you are new here, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button. Drop a comment telling me what you felt when he said those 2 words. Stay with me. We are going in. What the corridor carried. The Palace of Valdenmere in the deepest season of winter was a place of particular beauty and particular cruelty, often at the same time. The stone walls held cold the way memory held grief, quietly and without announcement, and the fires in every room could never quite drive it out. The corridors were the worst of it. Long and echoing and lit by wall sconces that threw more shadow than light, they carried sound the way water carried weight. Efficiently and without mercy. Seraphine Vale had learned this at the age of 11, when she first arrived at the palace as the daughter of Viscount Aldrich Vale, appointed to the court as a ward companion to the Queen's younger lady. She had learned it again at 14, at 16, and at 21. The corridors of Valdenmere held nothing back. She was 23 now. She had grown careful because of those corridors. Careful with her voice, careful with her expression, careful above all with any display of feeling that could be collected and used against her. She moved through the palace like a woman who understood that she was being watched and had decided the only dignified response was to give them nothing worth watching. This did not satisfy her mother. The Viscountess Aldera Vale was a handsome woman in her early 50s who had spent 3 decades at court navigating every social current with the skill of someone who treated the world as a series of transactions to be optimized. She had produced 2 sons who were both excellently married, one daughter who had made a quiet match with a respectable baron, and then Seraphine. Seraphine, who had been promised twice and both times the arrangement had collapsed. Seraphine, who said the wrong things at the wrong moments not out of stupidity but out of an inability to perform a warmth she did not feel for men she did not respect. Seraphine, whose composure under pressure certain people called coldness and whose directness certain other people called difficult. Her mother called it broken. The morning of the incident, Seraphine had been walking back from the library wing with a volume of correspondence history tucked under her arm. She had risen early, avoided the breakfast salon where the court ladies assembled to dismantle each other gently over tea, and had spent the preceding hour in the library in a silence that had very nearly constituted peace. She turned into the main east corridor and her mother materialized from a side passage, apparently having stationed herself there for exactly this purpose. "You were not at breakfast," her mother opened. Seraphine adjusted her grip on the book. "I was in the library. Lady Hartwell noticed your absence. Again. You cannot keep disappearing. I was 30 meters away in the same building. That is not the point. Lady Hartwell has a nephew who has expressed interest and you are making this impossible." Seraphine said nothing. She had met Lord Hartwell's nephew once, at a garden reception the previous summer. He had spent the evening evaluating her the way one evaluated livestock, and had at one point asked her, with complete seriousness, whether she could be taught to be more agreeable. She had politely declined the implied arrangement. Her mother had not forgiven her. This is the pattern, her mother continued, her voice lifting in the way it did when she had decided the conversation required a larger audience than was technically present. This is always the pattern with you. Any man who comes within range you push away. Any opportunity you sabotage. You are 23 years old and you have nothing to show for it, and I have spent years trying to understand what is wrong with you. Seraphine kept her eyes on the middle distance. The corridor was not empty. 2 footmen stood at the far end pretending to be furniture. A court lady whose name she could not currently locate had appeared at a doorway to the left, listening with the focused attention of someone who had just been handed a gift. "There is nothing wrong with me," Seraphine said, quietly. "There is everything wrong with you," her mother replied, and her voice carried beautifully. "You are too broken to be loved. No man of rank will take you. I have watched you drive every possibility away, and I am telling you plainly because no one else will. You are a burden dressed in silk and nothing more." The corridor went absolutely still. And then, from the far end of the passage, came the sound of deliberate footsteps. Seraphine did not turn. She had learned years ago not to turn toward sounds in the Valdenmere corridors, because turning gave people the satisfaction of seeing your face when it was doing something unguarded. She kept her eyes level and her spine straight and breathed with the careful control of someone who was preventing a number of things from happening simultaneously. The footsteps stopped very close. She turned then because there was nothing else to do, and found herself facing Dre, the Duke-King of Valdenmere. She had seen him many times at the palace. Everyone at the palace had seen him many times. He was not a man who occupied space subtly. He was tall and broad-shouldered with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of face that had been constructed for authority, strong jaw, straight dark brows, dark eyes that processed everything and performed nothing. He was 34 and had been Duke-King for 9 years, having inherited a duchy in financial ruin and rebuilt it through what the court alternately called brilliance and ruthlessness, and was probably correct to call both. He was not looking at her mother. He was looking at Seraphine. His dark eyes moved across her face with the same methodical attention she imagined he gave to everything, not intrusive, not searching, simply present. Fully present in the way that very few people ever were. He said, quietly, "I heard you." 2 words. For her. Not for her mother. For Seraphine. Then he turned his gaze to the Viscountess and something in his expression shifted, not to anger, but to the particular quality of authority that did not require anger because it had never needed it. "You are wrong," he said. Simply that. And then he turned and walked away down the corridor with the same unhurried certainty with which he had arrived, and the corridor remained silent for a very long time after the sound of his steps faded. Seraphine stood there with a book under her arm and her mother beside her and the footmen at the far end pretending very hard to be furniture. She did not know what to feel. She understood that something had happened. She understood that the entire palace would know about it before noon. What she did not understand, what she could not yet begin to understand, was whether the Duke-King of Valdenmere had done what he did out of principle, out of irritation, out of impulse, or out of something else entirely. She would need, she understood, to find out. Subscribe if you have not already. Like this video. Tell me in the comments whether you believe him yet, because Seraphine does not. Not yet. Keep watching. The man who did not explain himself. By noon, the story had done precisely what Seraphine had expected it to do. It had moved through the palace like fire through dry paper, changing shape slightly with each telling but retaining its essential heat. By the time the midday meal was finished, at least 3 different versions were circulating. One in which the Duke-King had publicly rebuked the Viscountess on Seraphine's behalf, one in which he had declared some form of personal interest, and one, considerably more dramatic, in which he had announced an intention to court her on the spot. None of these versions were accurate. Seraphine knew this because she had been there. He had said 4 words. 2 to her and 2 about her mother. He had not explained himself. He had not elaborated. He had walked away. This was the thing she kept returning to as she sat in the window of her palace rooms in the afternoon with a cup of tea going cold in her hand. He had walked away. Without waiting to see how she received it. Without looking back to gauge the effect. The gesture had been complete in itself, from his perspective, apparently requiring no follow-up and no confirmation. She did not know what to do with that. She was accustomed to men who performed their regard for her in ways that made the performance unmistakable, because the performance was the point. She was accustomed to men who made a display of noticing her and then waited, visibly, to be thanked for noticing. She was accustomed, above all, to men who heard about her history, the 2 failed engagements, the reputation for being difficult. And either decided the challenge was interesting in the way that a puzzle was interesting, or simply moved on. Callan Dray appeared to belong to none of these categories. She did not see him for 3 days. On the 4th day, she encountered him in the palace library. This was, she would later reflect, not entirely coincidental on his part, though it had the appearance of coincidence. He was already there when she arrived, seated at the long central table with a set of documents spread before him, working with the focused efficiency of a man who treated all available time as a resource. He looked up when she entered. He nodded, once, with the acknowledgement one gave a known person in a shared space, and returned to his documents. Seraphine found her usual chair near the east window. She opened her book. For a while they sat in silence that had the particular texture of 2 people who are each very aware of the other but have decided, by unspoken agreement, to pretend otherwise. After perhaps 20 minutes, without looking up from his documents, Callan spoke. "You come here most mornings." Seraphine did not look up from her page either. "Most mornings." "Yes. Before breakfast." "The breakfast salon requires a performance I find exhausting before 10 in the morning." A brief pause. "Then, I find it exhausting after 10 as well." She looked up. He was still reading. The corner of his mouth had moved, very slightly, in a direction that might have been the foundation of something that would, in a less controlled face, have become a smile. Seraphine looked back at her book. She thought about asking. About the corridor. About the 2 words and the 2 other words and what precisely he had meant by all of them. She had the question fully formed, had been carrying it for 4 days, and it sat at the front of her mind with the insistent quality of things that needed addressing. She did not ask. He seemed, she had begun to understand, like the kind of man who acted when he was ready to act and explained himself when he was ready to explain. Pressing him felt, intuitively, like pressing something structural. Possibly fine, possibly catastrophic, no reliable way to know in advance. Instead she read. He worked. Outside the library windows, a light snow was beginning to fall in the pale winter courtyard below, and the only sound was the occasional turn of pages and the distant warmth of the fire at the room center. When she stood to leave an hour later, he looked up. "Seraphine," he said. "Not Lady Vale." Her name. First name. She stopped. He studied her with those dark eyes that seemed to have been calibrated for precision. Then he said. "What Lady Hartwell's nephew asked you last summer. Whether you could be taught to be more agreeable." She went very still. She had not told anyone that story. "You said no," he continued, and closed his document folder. That was the right answer. Then he returned to his papers and she left the library with the distinct and disorienting sensation of a woman who had just had her private history referenced by a man who had apparently done his own research, and had done it not to use against her but to say something she had needed to hear for considerably longer than a summer. What broken means and what it does not. The court, predictably, had opinions. The dominant one, circulated through the salon gatherings and the corridor conversations and the careful side-of-mouth exchanges that constituted the palace's true social infrastructure, was that the Duke-King was engaged in some form of political maneuver. Seraphine was the daughter of a viscount with useful land holdings in the north. A connection to the Vale family would provide certain geographic advantages. The apparent attention paid to Seraphine herself was simply the surface of something calculated beneath. Seraphine found this theory easier to tolerate than the alternative. The alternative was that he meant it. And meaning it opened questions she was not, after 23 years of being told she was too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones, remotely prepared to sit with. Her mother, for her part, had gone uncharacteristically quiet. The silence of a woman recalibrating, Seraphine recognized. Not contrite, the Viscountess was not built for contrition, but strategic. If the Duke-King of Valdenmere had fixed his attention on her most troublesome daughter, the Viscountess would need a new map. On the 6th day after the corridor, a formal invitation arrived at Seraphine's rooms. Not a social invitation. Not a supper arrangement or a garden walk, the usual choreography of courtly attention. An invitation to a private working meeting, in the Duke-King's public receiving room, to discuss the administration of the Northern Ward archives. Seraphine looked at this invitation for a long time. The Northern Ward archives were her project. She had proposed the reorganization to the palace secretary 8 months ago, had spent the intervening time doing the preliminary work herself because no one else had prioritized it, and had essentially been proceeding without institutional support because the institution had not yet decided whether to care. Someone had told him about it. Or he had found it himself, which seemed, given what she was beginning to understand about him, equally possible. She accepted. The receiving room was smaller than she expected, for a man of his rank. Most of the Duke-King's formal receiving rooms she had glimpsed over the years were the usual palace variety, large, coldly impressive, designed to remind the visitor of relative significance. This one had the quality of a room that was actually used. Maps on the walls with annotations. A wide working desk that held several active files. 2 chairs at a low table by the fire, which was where he directed her when she arrived. He had the archive proposal documents on the table between them. Her documents. He had read them with the density of annotation that meant he had read them more than once. "This is good work," he opened, without preamble. "The indexing system you have proposed solves a problem the palace has been not solving for 30 years. Seraphine sat in the chair across from him and looked at the annotated documents and felt something she was not sure she had a clean name for. Not gratitude exactly. Closer to the feeling of being seen accurately, which was rarer than gratitude and more unsettling. "No one prioritized it," she said. "People rarely prioritize problems they did not create," he said. "It does not mean the work is not worth doing." She looked at him. He looked back. The fire was behind him and the afternoon light was coming in from the high windows, and she had the strange and slightly suspended sensation of a moment that was taking longer than it should. She said, "Why did you say what you said in the corridor?" He did not seem surprised by the question. He leaned back slightly in the chair, which was the most physically relaxed she had seen him. "Because what she said was wrong," he said. "And it was said where people would hear it and remember it. And I did not want you to be alone with it in a corridor full of people who were going to do nothing." Seraphine held that. She held it the way one held something that required careful handling. "You do not know me," she said. "I know enough," he said. "I have been watching this court for 9 years. I know what useful people look like when the court has decided they are inconvenient. I know what careful composure looks like when it is covering something that was heard a long time ago. And I know the difference between a woman who is broken and a woman who has been told so often that she is broken that she has begun to perform the role simply to meet everyone's expectations." The room was very quiet. Seraphine said nothing for a long moment. Then, "That is a very precise thing to say about someone you do not know." Kaelin met her eyes with the steadiness she had come to understand was simply how he was. No performance in it. No bid for effect. Simply present. "Then correct me," he said. "If I have it wrong. I would rather know." She looked at the annotated documents on the table between them. She looked at his face. She thought about the 2 failed engagements, which had collapsed not because she was broken but because she had refused to make herself smaller in the way that both men had eventually, in different ways, required. She thought about the breakfast salons and the corridor and her mother's voice carrying beautifully through the stone passage. "You do not have it wrong," she said. He nodded, once, as though she had confirmed something he was using to build something else. He picked up the archive proposal. "Then let us discuss the indexing system," he said. "I want to allocate proper resources to this. Starting next week, if you agree." And they did. They spent 2 hours on it, and he asked questions that demonstrated he had genuinely understood the proposal, and he made suggestions that were good, and at no point during the 2 hours did the conversation feel like anything other than 2 people who both found the subject worth the time. When she stood to leave, she found that the thing she had been carrying since the corridor, the tight, braced quality of waiting for the other thing to land, the real motive, the reveal, had eased. Not gone. But eased. She was not yet foolish enough to call that trust. But it was something in the same direction. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video. And drop a comment telling me what moment in that room got you the most. Because I know which one it was for me. Keep watching. The shape of something beginning. The archive work became a reason. Not a pretense of a reason, the work itself was real and she was genuinely engaged with it, but a reason to be in the same room with him on a regular basis without the whole palace having to construct a narrative about it before they had even constructed anything themselves. Twice a week, she came to the receiving room with progress reports. He reviewed them with the same focused attention he apparently gave everything. They argued, on one occasion, about the best method for cross-referencing the ward boundary documents, and she held her position with the quiet firmness that most men had found disagreeable, and Kaelin listened to her argument fully and then said she was right and adjusted his recommendation without any of the wounded performance that being corrected usually produced in men of his rank. She noticed this. She filed it carefully. She also noticed that when she arrived he always had tea already prepared, which was either courtesy or foresight or both. She noticed that he did not speak over her, did not redirect the conversation to himself, did not appear to find her competence threatening in the way that competence in women was so often found threatening by men who thought of themselves as comfortable with it but proved otherwise under pressure. She noticed that he laughed once, properly, when she described the palace archivist's response to her proposed reorganization, which had been an expression of such comprehensive professional outrage that she had spent the entire walk back to her rooms working very hard not to laugh herself. His laugh was low and brief and entirely unperformed, and it changed the composition of his face in a way that made him look, for a moment, simply like a man who had found something genuinely funny. She liked him. She arrived at this conclusion with the wariness of someone diffusing something, because liking people had not historically been safe for her. The court had also arrived at conclusions, naturally. Lady Mira Coel, who functioned as the palace's most efficient social intelligence system, stopped Seraphine in the East Corridor one morning with the bright, loaded warmth of a woman carrying news she had already told 9 people. "The Duke-King takes his archive meetings very seriously," Lady Mira offered. "Archives are serious," Seraphine said. "He has not taken archive meetings with anyone before. Perhaps the archives were previously not in need of attention." Lady Mira smiled with the patience of someone who understood that this deflection was itself informative. "You are looking well," she said. "Better than before the winter began." She walked on. Seraphine stood in the corridor for a moment. She was aware that Lady Mira was not wrong. She had not looked well before the winter began. She had looked the way she always looked after a long stretch of being in her mother's orbit, closed in, careful, slightly gray around the edges in the way that sustained criticism made people gray. She looked better because she was sleeping more soundly and going to the library without guilt and spending 2 mornings a week in a room where she was taken seriously. She was aware that most of this had to do with Kaylin Dray. On a Tuesday in the 3rd week of the archive arrangement, she arrived to find that a formal letter had been placed on the table beside the tea. Addressed to her. From the palace secretary's office, which meant it had been approved at the highest level. It was an official appointment. Her name, attached to the position of Northern Records Advisor to the Duchy of Valdenmere. A formal position. Salaried. With an official seal. She read it twice. She looked up. Kaylin was watching her from across the table with the quality of attention that meant he had planned this and was now observing whether he had planned it correctly. "You did not ask me," she said. "I should have," he said. "I became certain before I remembered that certainty is not the same as permission. That was wrong of me. If you do not want it, it can be undone." She looked at the letter again. No one had ever created something and put her name on it. Things had been offered to her before. Arrangements, positions, introductions, but always with the quality of being done to her rather than for her. This felt different. She was not entirely sure she trusted the feeling. But she knew that she wanted the position, had wanted exactly this kind of position, had been doing the work for months without any institutional recognition because recognition had not been offered. "I want it," she said. "And next time, ask first." "Next time," he agreed. "I will." The 2 words sat between them with a weight that had nothing to do with archival administration. Next time. As though next time were already a given. As though he had already looked at the future and found her in it and was simply noting this fact for the record. Seraphine kept her expression level. She was practiced at this. Inside, something that had been braced for a very long time moved, very slightly, in the direction of release. What he said when there was no one watching. Her mother came to her rooms on a Wednesday. She came without announcement, which was her habit, on the assumption that rooms in a palace she frequented were subject to her arrival at any time. Seraphine opened the door and the Viscountess entered with the compressed energy of a woman who had been thinking hard for 2 weeks and had finally organized her thoughts into a formation she was prepared to deploy. She sat in the chair by the window. Seraphine sat across from her and waited. "The Duke-King," her mother began, "is an extraordinary match." "We are colleagues," Seraphine said. "We are working together on the archive project. You have a formal appointment now." "I earned the appointment. The work is real." Her mother looked at her with the assessing regard of a woman who had recalibrated and wished this to be known. "I was hard on you," she said. "In the corridor." Seraphine said nothing. This was as close to acknowledgement as her mother was capable of producing, and she had learned not to require more than what was offered. "But if he is genuinely interested," the Viscountess continued, "you should not push this one away." There it was. Not an apology. A strategy. "I do not push people away," Seraphine said, keeping her voice quiet. "I stop performing for people who have already decided what I should be." "That is not the same thing." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was not quite recognition but was in the same family. She left without pressing further, which was, for the Viscountess, its own kind of concession. Seraphine sat alone in her rooms for a while after. The winter afternoon was darkening early outside the window and the palace had settled into its pre-supper quiet. She thought about the corridor 3 weeks ago, and the library, and the receiving room, and the letter with the official seal. She thought about the way Kaylin looked at her, not with the evaluating quality of men who were deciding whether she was worth the complication, but with the settled attention of someone who had already decided and was now simply interested in the details. She thought about what it meant to be looked at like that by a man who had no reason to perform it. She went to find him. He was in the private garden off the south wing, which she knew from the palace staff was where he went in the late afternoon when he needed to think without being accessible. She had not planned to go there. She had started walking and arrived. He was standing at the low stone wall at the garden's edge, looking out at the winter grounds below. He heard her on the path and turned. He did not look surprised. He looked, she thought, as though he had been waiting. Not specifically today, not expecting this, but patient in the way of someone who had prepared themselves to wait as long as was necessary. She stopped a few feet from him. The cold was sharp and the light was going and the garden was empty of everyone else. She said, "My mother came today. She has decided the Duke-King is an excellent match and I should not push you away." Kaelin held her eyes. "And what do you think?" "I think," Seraphine said, "that I have spent most of my adult life being told what I am and what I am not, and that I am not very good at trusting assessments that come from outside." "That is reasonable," he said. "I think," she continued, "that you have been patient and consistent and that you have not once required me to perform anything for your benefit. And that this is so unusual in my experience that I keep waiting to find out what it is covering." "What would convince you," he said, "that there is nothing covering it?" "I do not know," she admitted. "I am not sure I know how to be convinced of that yet." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dormant garden and the last pale light was fading from the sky behind the palace walls. "Then I will wait," he said. "Until you do know. There is no urgency from my side. I am not going anywhere." Seraphine looked at him. She looked at the plainness of it. No performance, no bid for credit for his patience, no implicit expectation of reward for saying the right thing. Simply a statement of intent. "I am not going anywhere." She said, quietly, she was wrong. "My mother." What she said in the corridor. "Yes," he said. "I know she was wrong. I have known it for a long time. I simply needed to hear someone else say it out loud. In a corridor. Where everyone could hear." Kaelin's expression shifted. Not a large shift. But the thing that happened in his face in that moment was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. Something that was not performance and not authority and not calculation. Simply a man who had said something because it needed to be said and was hearing, now, that it had mattered. He stepped forward and held out his hand. The same gesture as at the end of the corridor 3 weeks ago, direct and old-fashioned and entirely without theater. She did not hesitate this time. She placed her hand in his. His hand was warm and steady and he held hers the way he did everything, with full attention, no performance, no half-measures. They stood at the wall of the winter garden as the last light left the sky and the palace fires began to glow amber in the windows around them. She did not know, yet, how this ended. She had not been designed, by experience or disposition, for certainty of this kind. But she was standing in a winter garden with her hand in the hand of a man who had heard her called broken and treated it as a statement he intended to spend as long as necessary correcting. That, she thought, was a place to begin. Thank you for watching all the way through. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something when he said "I am not going anywhere," then please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about a woman being seen properly for the first time. And drop a comment below telling me which moment broke you open because I read every single one. I will see you in the next story.